For those who are not SACU members, welcome. SACU members will know that this is SACU's 60th year. And so we're delighted that in our big, busy program we've got planned for this year, we're starting with this lecture series all about the contribution that Confucius can bring to our thinking. If you're not a SACU member, a little advert, please do consider joining us. Lots of benefits from joining us. So I'm delighted that we're going to be introducing you to Katherine and Kelly, who will be running this seminar series for us once a year for the whole of the year. They are experts in this field, but I will leave them to introduce themselves and explain about that. But I would say that SACU is really honoured that we're able to share their expertise with you. So what we've done is divide the 12 seminars into blocks of 3. And I do hope you will sign up for the remaining 2 in this series, in this block. After this session, you will need to go back to the Eventbrite link and register. So just to remind ourselves of what we've got coming up in this series. So this series 1 is called Daily Life at Home. And this is the first seminar in that series, and it's How to Live, a Confucian Guide to Our Daily Roles. And then in February, we're going to have How to Overcome the Generation Gap, a Confucian Guide to Home Life. And then the third one in the series is How to Speak Well, a Confucian Guide to Conversation. So they all sound really intriguing titles, and I'm looking forward to hearing all about them. So just before I hand over to our eminent speakers, I just wanted to explain the plan of campaign for this 1 hour together. So the idea is Kelly and Katherine will share their thinking and give us a lecture for about 45 minutes. And then there'll be 15 minutes in which they will respond to any questions. So as questions occur to you, please do type them into the chat, because the way they will decide how to use that 15 minutes is they will read your questions that you've written into the chat, and they will pick them out and respond to them. That's the best way so that they can group together people's thinking where it's appropriate. If I can ask everyone, please, to keep themselves on mute. This is not a webinar, it's a live meeting. So please do keep yourself on mute, otherwise you will interrupt proceedings. So great to welcome you on behalf of SACU, as I say, and another advert. Do consider joining us if you're not already a member. So I'll now hand over to Katherine and Kelly to run the series, run the seminar for us.
Thank you so much, Zoe. It's a real honor for us to be back at SACU, really. I really feel very humbled to be able to contribute to the wonderful work and the wonderful mission of SACU through these series of lectures planned for the year ahead. This time, I'm joined by my colleague, but also my sister, Kelly, Dr. Kelly No. We're both lecturers at the University of Wales, Trinity, St. David. By way of background, I actually studied and worked for a number of years as a medical doctor before actually embarking on sinology and also doing doctoral studies in sinology and research. But I guess I come to sinology or the Confucian tradition from a different perspective compared to perhaps your ordinary the Chinese studies kind of academic. I'll let Kelly introduce herself and say a few words before we continue.
I think I completely second Katherine. It's an absolute honour to join everybody this evening. I'm very delighted to share with you about this art of living from the Confucian tradition. And I suppose, like Katherine, Chinese studies or sinology has been a love, a passion. I was formerly a senior lawyer training in London. I worked in London, in Australia, Sydney, for almost 10 years. So specialising in advising construction and infrastructure law. Confucian thinking, the Confucian tradition is, on the surface, it seems poles apart from legal advice and expertise. Perhaps at the very roots, I've discovered a lot that resonates in being, so much a part of life and work. So you'll hear more from us about that very subject later on.
So I'm going to begin the lecture today, and I'll be leading this particular lecture. Kelly will take the lead for lectures in the future. And I want to begin by telling you a story. And this story is actually recorded in the school sayings of Confucius in Chinese, 孔子家语. This is a text much like the Analects. Some of you may have heard of the Analects, which records Confucius's words, but also about his life. This particular story takes place in Confucius's home state of Lu. And it first starts by describing a man who's quite frugal, almost to the point of being miserly. And he loves to cook in this earthenware pot that looks something like this. And even in the times of Confucius, cooking in this pot would have been considered quite unrefined. But nevertheless, one day, he really enjoyed what he had cooked. And he decided to share some with Confucius. So he filled up an earthenware plate, also not very anything special, with this food and brought it to Confucius. Now, at the time, Confucius was actually with quite a few other students who observed that when he received this gift, he was overjoyed as if he had received ceremonial offerings. So what are ceremonial offerings? So these are sort of offerings, the sort of highest quality food that are fit for offerings, for ancestral commemoration ceremonies, or these sorts of ceremonies, which were considered the most formal occasions in the calendar. So you had to provide the best food. And in those days, the food was several types of meat, for example. And this was not something that the everyday, common person would have every day. The three types of meat were beef, mutton, and pork. And so this was the so-called highest quality ceremonial offerings, sort of like in a modern context, it would be like, Confucius acting as if he had received some Michelin-starred gourmet food, when in fact he just received baked beans. Okay. So quite, expectedly, Confucius's response probably left some of the students feeling quite confused, but of course they were a bit too polite to ask, except one of the students. So Zilu, who's pictured here, was the oldest student. He was younger than Confucius by 9 years. He had this very outspoken, direct personality, and he asked the question that was on everyone's mind, which was, the food was nothing special, and the presentation was even more simple. But why was it that, Confucius, why was it that you were so overjoyed? So Confucius explains that it wasn't because of how delicious the food was, how gourmet the food was, or even the presentation, but because when this man considered his food lavish, enjoyable, he thought of me. I think this short story really sort of highlights what Confucius thought and said, which has been recorded in the texts, these ancient texts, was a response to everyday life and society. And this is the focus of this series of talks of Confucianism, or this Confucian tradition, as a practical guide to life. In fact, last year, Kelly and I were invited to conduct a masterclass on Confucian philosophy at a high school in Cardiff. This masterclass was not for the students, it was actually for the teachers. And out of the teachers, there was one teacher who actually had a doctorate in religion. Out of the teachers, another teacher had a doctorate in philosophy. But we didn't really know their backgrounds. It was only during the lunchtime conversation that we actually realized. And we started the masterclass by saying that Confucius thought of himself as a teacher. He didn't think of himself as, engaging in philosophical inquiry or espousing religious doctrines. He thought of it as a learning for living. And even throughout the rest of Chinese history, Confucius is celebrated as a teacher. So this wonderful calligraphy by the longest serving emperor in Chinese history, Emperor Kangxi, is about Confucius, celebrating him as the exemplary teacher for all ages. And this kind of teaching, or this kind of learning, was a kind of learning about how to live one's life, providing practical tools by which we could respond to people and things that happen to us. In fact, this very much is consistent, and we would very much agree with the words of American sinologist Jeffrey Ritchie, who describes Confucianism through the framework of cultural repertoire theory in the recently published Oxford Handbook of Confucianism. And this theory of cultural repertoire theory doesn't come from Chinese studies. It actually comes from psychology, but also sociology. So what does cultural repertoire mean? So it's looking at this Confucian cultural tradition as a toolkit. So repertoire being a toolkit. And it's a toolkit. It could be stories, ideas, rituals, symbols, which we take on and we use in varying degrees, clearly not at the same time in every situation, but in different situations, and to solve our problems in life. So this is this idea of using Confucianism as a cultural repertoire. And in fact, this thinking about Confucianism is becoming an increasing trend that we see in the academic discourse. There's increasing interest in looking at Confucianism in this way. It's quite topical, actually. But last year, when I was in Seoul at the World Consortium for Research in Confucian Cultures conference, and that sort of brings together scholars from around the world and scholars undertaking research in, as it mentions here, Confucian heritage cultures. So it's not just China, but also Korea, Japan, Vietnam, etc. And the focus of the conference was to look at Confucianism as a cultural resource for modern crises today. So it's very much applied, thinking about this tradition and its tools for our society today. And as part of this conference, in fact, the keynote speaker was Stephen Engel, who presented on a very successful series of courses at his university, which looks at philosophy as a way of life. So this is the webpage. So it's called Living a Good Life. And this idea of philosophy as a way of life was coined by French philosopher Pierre Hadot. The idea that philosophy gives us exercises or activities by which we can improve our lives. And so this course is quite unique. The special feature about this course is not only is it looking across philosophies, so not just Confucianism, but you can see there's Stoicism as well. But every week, the undergraduate students will have an exercise or an activity in which the philosophy is boiled down into ideas in which they can actually use and they focus on in their lives, and they journal about it. And Steve was talking about how there's the feedback has been really positive, in the sense that undergraduates will come up to him and say, this is the most relevant course that I've taken at university. And we had a really great conversation after his talk, because of course this is something that we're trying to do at the University of Wales Trinity St David through our own sinology courses, making them increasing that practical aspect. And he shared about a story of one of the students. During the day, they had a lecture on the thought of a Confucian scholar, and then at night, this particular student has an argument with their college roommate. And rather than reacting in a normal way that student would have reacted, sort of took a step back and thought, okay, what would that Confucian scholar have done in this instance? And actually, it resolved his problem, it resolved the argument, using the thought of the Confucian scholar that he had learned that very day. So this idea of philosophy as a way of life, is of increasing interest, but certainly, what Confucius talked about in his the recorded words and his life that's been observed and recorded. So Steve also has written a very accessible Confucian guide to life. The idea that, yes, Confucianism can be thought of as a philosophical discourse, can be thought of in an academic, theoretical way, but there are so many things in there that are very, very practical for our lives today. And as you heard from our backgrounds, we don't come from a Western philosophy background, but because of our prior training and our career, our focus is very much on, how is it relevant? How can it be made accessible for everyday lives and for non-specialists? So for any discipline or any other person that wants to learn, to make it available. So that's our aim. And when Kelly and I were designing this lecture series, we were very much inspired by this book series from the Princeton University Press. And it was called Ancient Wisdom for Modern Readers. There's actually a number of books in the series now, but what it does is that it goes back to the original sources. Okay, so back to the primary sources. See here, they've got on the right-hand side, how to have willpower, and that's looking at ancient Greek and also Latin writings. But what they've done is they've provided sort of modern translations and selections, so they're sort of excerpts from those writings on this particular topic. You can see here on the left writings from an 8th century Buddhist Indian monk. So these guides really sort of break down the barrier, the language barrier. The reader doesn't have to understand Sanskrit or ancient Greek or Latin, but they can also tap into these cultural resources, tap into this ancient wisdom. So Kelly and I thought, well, that actually they have yet to publish a guide using Confucian writings. So we thought, this is something that is that is useful, and we want this lecture series to focus on this how-to. So you can see here the various topics. So of course, Zoe's mentioned some of them already, but how to eat, how to entertain, how to lead, how to learn. So focusing on certain sort of parts of life or areas of our lives, but using the Confucian perspective to enrich our understanding. And despite the various topics, there's many here, and different areas of our lives, actually the common thread that runs through all of these topics is relationships. It's interpersonal relationships, people in our lives. And ultimately, that is the very core of Confucian thinking, the human relationships. We know, of course, that no human is an island, that when we are born into a web of social relationships. And this was not something that just Confucius mentioned, but modern social sciences have also provided a lot of evidence to show us the very social nature of human existence. So here, Matthew Lieberman, his wonderful book on how we are wired to be social, He looks at neuroimaging, neuropsychology, so using science to look at how our brains react when we have really meaningful relationships. And it's these relationships, families, friends, etc., that form our identities, that allow us to live really meaningful lives. So that's from the modern social sciences perspective. But what's really unique to what the Confucian tradition has to say, and in fact, this Confucian tradition has really informed the East Asian concept of the self. So, how we think about ourselves. The East Asian concept of the self is quite unique. It's unique because the self is, from the East Asian perspective, is very much integrated with these relationships. You could say it's the relationships that allow us to realize our human potential from the East Asian perspective, from the Confucian perspective. It's our relationships that ultimately help us develop into full human beings. And this is well articulated through the work of Roger Ames and Henry Rosemont Jr. In the Confucian role ethics, what they term Confucian role ethics, but it's a way of looking at Confucian thought. So as I say here, we are the sum of the roles we live in consonance with our fellows. So you can see here the self in the middle, but also, all those concentric circles being all the various relationships that we have in our lives, all the various roles. And there are many. So, if we think about it, from let's say one day, in the course of one day, perhaps when we're at work, we are an employee, we have an employer. So that's the leader subordinate relationship. But also at work, we could be a manager. So then we also take on the role of a leader. At work, we have colleagues, friends. So that's a friendship relationship. And then outside of work, we could attend a family gathering. So we could be, a cousin, an auntie, an uncle, a grandparent, etc. So there's many roles, and we met, as we all would know, we wear so many hats throughout the day, and sometimes actually more than one hat at one time. But the point is that all of these roles help define us. And in the Confucian framework, all of these roles and relationships can be boiled down into 5 foundational relationships. So I'm going to briefly explain these. So the so-called 5 foundational relationships, you could say, are sort of 5 broad categories by which all various human relations can be boiled down into the 5 types. So first of all, the parent and child relationship. So this is something that, we have the moment that we're born. Right? But of course, the parent and child relationship is not just simply between mother, father, and child, but actually can also include very complex family dynamics. So it could also include step-parents, adopted parents, grandparents, aunties and uncles, those who take on that carer role in one's life, and their family elders, you could say, in relation to the child. And the child, of course, then can be an adopted child, can be a stepchild, can be a niece or nephew, if you are in that carer role. So you can see how actually, even though it says parent and child, the scope can be quite broad. In Chinese thinking, this parent and child relationship, there's a wonderful metaphor, and takes the metaphor of a tree for the family. And so the tree is the family, or the parents are the roots of that tree. And as I say, the parents are the roots, the children are the shoots. So the children, through their interactions with the parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles, elders, will learn and develop and be nourished through that relationship, that very first relationship in their lives. And it's also the roots because it provides the foundation upon which they then build and then grow. So that's the parent and child relationship, the first of the 5. Continuing from that, we look at the sibling relationship. And if we continue with the metaphor of the tree, the siblings are likened to branches of the same tree. So they're connected by the trunk and they grow from the same roots. Again, the siblings, not just brothers and sisters, but they could also be step siblings. It could be adopted siblings. And, these, even though we think, okay, modern families are so complicated, but actually in the times of Confucius, there were very complicated family dynamics as well. Confucius himself had a stepbrother. So actually it does, it can be adapted and thought of in the modern context. So that's the second relationship, the relationship between siblings. The third relationship is also within the family, and it's the relationship between spouses or partners. And interestingly, oftentimes this relationship is provided as the first relationship of the 5, because the logic is you can't have the children without the partner, and so on. But the way I've ordered it here is in terms of one's life journey. So it's the moment that you're born, you have the parent and child relationship, then siblings, and so forth. And the first 3 that you can see here are those within the family. The last 2 then are outside the family. So we've talked about leader and subordinate. But of course, this relationship is not just in one's paid work. Okay, so it could also involve volunteer work. Or you could be the captain of a sports team, and you'd have your team members. So that would also be a leadership position. And in fact, any sort of organized activity, you'll always have someone who has to do all the running around, organizing. That person would be the leader. So that leadership role. So that's leader and subordinate. And then finally, the relation between friends, which is the outside the family and between equals. Okay, so that you're considered equal counterparts in this relationship. Now, even though sometimes there's a misconception about the Confucian framework of relationships, and that is that it can be quite hierarchical. So clearly leader, subordinate, parent and child, but actually when we look into the ancient literature, we see that these relationships are considered to be mutually interdependent. So you can't be a leader if you have no subordinates. And in fact, you have to rely on your team members. You have to rely on them. The team members also rely on the leader, vice versa. And it's a matter of sort of working together to achieve shared goals. And that's the same for all of these relationships. Particularly within the family, as the family working together to develop together. So these are the 5 foundational relationships. And clearly we can identify perhaps some of the roles, so 5 relationships, but 10 roles, so 2 roles in each of the relationships, as you can see. And whilst we can identify them in our lives today, and you might say, well, what's Confucian about it? Actually, the way that the Confucian tradition talks about these relationships is that they're not just descriptive. We're not just describing them, but they're actually prescriptive or normative in a way. That each of these roles has certain expectations. And a very simple way of understanding this is, let's say, for example, a friend. Okay, so in that role of being a friend, you could be a friend who completely neglects other friends and just thinks of yourself. That's one type of friend. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you would be the best friend. As we say, a friend in need is a friend indeed. So in that spectrum, there's room for growth. room for improvement. And that's what the Confucian tradition would say is where we develop as humans. So, if we identify ourselves, how can we improve in this particular role? And then through all of our roles. And when I say it's prescriptive, it's not prescriptive in the sense of judging others. They're a poor friend or they're a really good friend. Actually, it's prescriptive because we have to evaluate ourselves. It's not about others. So we evaluate ourselves and we try to grow in areas that we can improve. So it's a very sort of reflective practice in which we then look into through this framework, look at our various roles in our lives, and then think about how it is that we can, that space for development, not only to help the other person, but actually to help ourselves grow. And this idea of sort of evaluating ourselves rather than others actually comes through very often in the literature. So I'm going to take you through an excerpt from one of the ancient texts. It's called The Practice of the Mean, in Chinese, Zhongyong. And this was a very important text read by almost every literate person for about the last 600 years of late imperial Chinese history, because it was actually a compulsory text for the civil service exams. So they had to learn this if they wanted to pass their exams. Now there's a sort of excerpt in there, and it has, it's a quote from Confucius. And it begins by talking about the way of the noble person has 4 aspects. And so Confucius talks about 4 out of the 5 relationships here. But first of all, who is a noble person? So a noble person can be anyone. Okay, so it's, in other words, it's a person with noble character. It's not talking about a person of nobility in the sense that they have to be born into, title and rank in a particular family. The noble person is a person of noble character. And it's anyone can be this noble person because actually Confucius said it's a level of learning. It's not a title, it's a level of learning. Now, a really good analogy is to think about learning a language. Okay, so learning a language, there are also various levels. On the left, you can see is the level where you haven't even thought about learning another language. You don't want to. You're not interested. So that's level 0. There's not learning. Okay, then you start learning. You're a beginner, and so on until the other end of the spectrum when you're fluent. You're almost native speaker level, and you don't have to think about the language anymore. You can just respond as a native speaker would. Now, the noble person is also a level of learning. And in fact, you would say it's an intermediate level in terms of this Confucian learning. The Confucian learning also has 5 levels. And it goes from an ordinary person, so before someone who is not really interested or hasn't even looked at this Confucian learning, to the other end of the spectrum, which is a sage. So that would be someone like Confucius. Confucius himself said that at the age of 70, he didn't even need to think, and he just was able to practice the scholarship. Whereas the noble person is the intermediate level, which means that they actually have to put in conscious effort to try to, put the learning to really practice it in their daily life. And if we come back to the language analogy, it's sort of like a person who's a beginner would still be, reading the textbooks. They need to, get their pronunciation right before they can speak. But at an intermediate level, they can go out. They're using their language. They can see the responses of others when they can communicate effectively. They can also see that they're actually able to express their meaning, their feelings, and it's quite self-motivating then. So this is the same as the noble person, a person of noble character who's achieved this level of what's called a noble character. And what happens is that they are beyond the classroom now. It's not just about the texts. They're using it in their lives, and they are seeing the very productive, meaningful connections, relationships that they have. And as a result, it's this positive feedback cycle where they can, they are motivated, they're self-motivated, and, mastery or becoming a sage is on the horizons. So this is the noble person. And we said that the noble person could be anyone. It could be someone who's 17, someone who's 70, someone in the times of Confucius or 21st century, someone in China or outside of China. So the noble person really has this, as I mentioned, a level of learning. Now, the other word here that needs explaining is the way with the capital W. In Chinese, it's pronounced as the Dao. But of course, this Confucian Dao is not the same as the Dao in Taoism. Okay, so the Tao of Taoism is slightly different. Here, we're talking about the way, and that's why I've put here a picture of a path. It's sort of a way that all these that noble people, a person of noble character, will have to walk this path. And what does it mean? Is that even though, as I mentioned, it could be anyone, 17 to 70-year-old, anywhere around the world throughout time and space, but generally, the person of noble character will respond to the world in similar ways. Okay? And an example is, say, for example, the noble person hears about their friend who's grieving. Now, they will probably reach out and try to express their sympathy, their condolences. Now, in the 21st century, you might pick up the phone, send a message on WhatsApp. In the times of Confucius, it would have been different. And so even though the way that they do things might be different, but the way they respond is similar. So they're still expressing sympathy. So that's the way of the noble person. It has 4 aspects. But before Confucius continues, he says here, quite interestingly, I've not yet been able to achieve a single one of them. Now, this particular sentence has left scholars throughout history baffled. Why did Confucius say this? And there's 2 interpretations. The first is that he's probably very humble. He doesn't even feel that he's reached the level of a sage, or even reached the level of a noble person. So he says, I still have yet to be a noble person. The other interpretation is that Confucius is encouraging us, that he's trying to tell us that this doesn't take one day. It's something that you have to do over a period of time. So he's trying to tell his students to put in effort, because I haven't even achieved it. So as the students, they should be putting in more efforts. So there's 2 reasons why Confucius said this. But what he goes on to say is what we are familiar with when we looked at the 5 relationships, which is 4 of those roles. So what is looked for in a child, serving their parent, I'm not yet able to do. And then, what's looked for in a subordinate, what's looked for as a younger brother, whether he was a younger brother, what's looked for in a friend. And it's the same pattern, which he says, I'm not yet able to do so. So in other words, what Confucius is trying to tell us here goes back to that idea of that it's prescriptive, but it's self-evaluative. That we have to look within ourselves. We have to be the example. And these relationships help us in guide us. So, as a subordinate, the question is then, how would I expect or my subordinates to respond to me? And that provides us with some guidelines as to how we might respond to our own manager or the head of the organization. So this is that kind of evaluative aspect or self-reflective aspect as we move through our lives in various roles. So Confucius was quite clear that if you wanted to achieve the level of a noble person, person of noble character, then it's through these roles, it's through these relationships. He was so, this formed such an integral part of his thinking that when he talks about, humanity, when he talks about our qualities as a human, he also defines it through the ideas of our relationships. So actually, there's another very interesting excerpt in the Analects in which one of the students, Fan Shi, asks Confucius about humanity, this very core concept in Confucianism. And Confucius says quite simply, it's not this abstract theoretical idea, but it's to love people, it's to care and have concern for others. So humanity, as I mentioned, is very core. Just take some time to describe the actual character because it's quite interesting. So humanity is written this way in Chinese. It's pronounced as ren, and it's actually made up of two parts, one on the left and one on the right, as you can see. So we'll split them up. On the left is the character for human or person, and on the right is the character for two. So you can see the two horizontal lines, word for two. And it's interesting because you can see here the word human makes up the word for humanity, just like in the English, human, humanity. So that's why I prefer this translation of Ren as humanity. It's the core of being a human. But why is it the core? Well, when the humanity, according to Confucianism, is when we think about ourselves, which is this side here, then we think about others. Now, it's two because if we think back to those relationships, every relationship has two roles. So we think about ourselves in our role, whether it's a subordinate, as a daughter or son, sibling, friend. We will think about the other person in that relationship. And that's the start of this humanity, developing this innate humanity. And to the extent that we can sort of be connected, over time becomes a natural sort of habit, and then we are connected to humanity as a whole and not just the other person in that relationship. So that's why humanity, this concept, is so core in Confucian thinking, that Confucius thought that was actually innate, is part of who we are, and it's how we grow, but also ultimately how we are then connected to the rest of humanity. So Fan Shi was quite happy with that response. Loving people, being caring, that's quite easy to understand. So he then asks about wisdom. And then Confucius defines it very succinctly as well. He said it's to know people, which is not just about remembering their names. It's the idea that, we actually get to know them, their motivations, their hopes, their worries. And that's how we get along with them. So the wisdom and the humanity actually very integrally connected. Knowing people takes time and effort. Why would we do that? Because we care. That's the humanity. So wisdom comes from humanity. And when we look at this, how humanity and wisdom are connected, you see very clearly in Chinese philosophy that the heart and the mind, the cognition and emotion are also connected. They're not separate. There's a non-duality between the heart and mind. So the cognition, which is how we think, what we think, is not separate from how we feel in Chinese philosophy and Confucian philosophy, and that's not difficult to understand when we think about these relationships. So as an example, my youngest cousin is going for his first job interview next week. So this is a fact, I know this, but actually I feel nervous for him as well. So this is connected to this feeling. So what I know is connected to this feeling. And Confucius was very adamant that, when we learn, this learning is, we have to really enjoy it. So it might be quite different if you have a Western philosophy background, in the sense that, in Western philosophy, there's duality. The reasoning mind must avoid all of these emotions. We don't let emotions cloud our judgment. But Confucius, when we read the texts like the Analects, he comes across as a character that's full of life. He's full of emotion. And there's, very famous lines which illustrate this. So I'll just share with you very briefly, because I know looking at the time. But it's Zulu again, the student, and he's asked by a minister from another state about Confucius. So, this Duke has never met Confucius before. So he asks Zulu to describe his teacher. But Zulu is sort of put on the spot, right? And he sort of, doesn't know how to respond. Confucius is someone he greatly admires, and he doesn't know how to describe him in a few words. So he actually doesn't respond. He doesn't know what to say. But actually, he later reflects on this and goes, it's something that I have to ask. He's the kind of person who will readily admit, his faults and want to improve himself. So the following day, he goes and sees Confucius and asks this very question to his teacher. And Confucius says, well, why don't you just say to them that as a person, Confucius is so excited about learning and teaching that he actually forgets to eat. He's enjoying himself so much that he forgets to worry. And he's actually forgets about old age. So in this self-bio, Confucius self-bio here, in 3 lines, sort of tells us, he doesn't say, I'm this kind of teacher or where I work. He actually tells you his feelings. You can see he's really passionate. He's really excited about learning, about living. And so much so that, life goes by and, it's, so you just see that in what he says. So the idea of how we feel about this learning is not separate. In fact, the feelings help us motivate us, just like our humanity helps motivate us to really get to the bottom of the people around us and so that we get along with them. So this so-called humanity is the heart of wisdom in Confucian thinking. So I'm going to end here with this line from Roger Ames, that Confucian learning in a nutshell is really it's a personal commitment. Okay? So it's not, asking of others. It's something that we do for ourselves. And it's to achieve, as it says here, relational virtuosity, but really what that means is a mastery of our relationships, our roles. It begins within the family. So the family relationships, the first 3 of the 5. But then through these sort of early steps, as we develop ourselves, it ultimately leads to meaning in our personal lives, meaning in our relationships, so the social aspect, and then ultimately a greater sort of influence beyond the people that we interact with. And that's what is meant here by this cosmic meaning. So Confucian learning is something that, today, what we've tried to cover is very broad. It's the foundations through providing a framework for you to think about this Confucian learning through the relationships. But it's a framework in which we hope to develop and provide more specific takeaways in the lectures in the future. So leave you with that thought. And I'm going to just now look at the chat. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. Kelly and I will have a look at them. Let me have a look at that now. Okay, so I have one question from Rob. Thank you very much for your question. The initial story of acceptable offerings seems to come from the I Ching. To what extent is Confucian thinking earlier than Confucius? I'm really glad that you asked this question because this was actually a question that I wanted to ask. Do you think that Confucianism was founded by Confucius? And Confucius himself would say that he didn't find any, he didn't innovate, right? He transmitted this tradition from ancient thinkers, ancient sages who, when we say the sage, we're talking about that highest level of cultivation in which they were able to live and practice and really bring about personal, social, and cosmic meaning in their lives and lives of others. So Confucius didn't say that he created anything. You could say that he was the first to really articulate a system of thought that could then be passed down through the generations. And so I would agree with you that, what we would say right now is Confucian thinking, which, we derive from the record of his ideas, which is, in various texts like the I Ching, 5 classics, and so on, that actually we call it Confucian, but actually it comes before Confucius. And Confucius actually was the one to really articulate it in this systematic way. But the word Confucianism is coined by the Jesuits. It is a English term, but the idea is that when they first encountered China, they thought of Confucianism as this, and as an ism, right? As an ism, like what we have, Buddhism, etc. But the idea was that they thought of it as a kind of thinking or ideology. So this is coined later. But in the times of Confucius, the Chinese word is rule. So what some sinologists will call ruism. They don't want to use Confucianism, they call it ruism, or sort of classical learning. And classical meaning going back to the ancient traditions, and sort of learning from the traditions, not being stuck in old ways, but re-articulating, appropriating, using it for the times that you are in. And this is something that generations of scholars did throughout Chinese history. When it became the state, Confucianism became the state ideology 2,000 years ago, in the Han Dynasty, that they took these ideas through the text, as it was transmitted in the text, but then provided their own interpretations, commentaries, and their articulation for their times. So the idea is that Confucian thought is quite dynamic. It's used for our times. It's a tool, as Jeffrey Rishi, but other sinologists have mentioned. It's this tool, a toolkit that you can use for your times, which is being evidenced by so many generations of Confucian scholars throughout Chinese history. So yeah, that's a wonderful question, and thank you to Rob for that question. Yes. Thinking.
Michael, do you want to put your question in the chat, or are you?
Oh, okay, thanks.
It'd be helpful, then we can all read it. Do you know what I mean? It's easier.
Yeah, I guess sometimes with these online seminars, the technology can really play up. So having everything on the chat is quite makes it clearer. So I didn't ask if Kelly had anything further to add on my response.
While we're waiting for Michael's question, I would only add that as a small example of these generations of Confucian scholars, also started off by Confucius himself, that the classic of changes, the I Ching, there are many layers of commentary, including ones attributed to Confucius, and the Duke of Zhou, etc. And that is part of the Confucian tradition, sort of re-articulating the tradition for one's own times, making it relevant and meaningful. That's as a small example. I thought that was an excellent answer, Katherine. I've got nothing else really to add. Thank you.
We've got just about 5 minutes. If anybody else wants to put any questions into the chat, do type away. We've got our experts with us for a few more minutes.
Roz, wonderful. So was it the imperial exams which helped pass down Confucian thinking? That's also a very good question about the examination system, which was, I guess, started to be established in the Sui dynasty, and then was really fully established in the Song dynasty. So Sui dynasty is sort of 6th century. Song dynasty, we're looking at 11th century, and the idea then is that for those of you who might not be familiar, the imperial exams sort of imperially decreed that anyone who wanted to be part of the government service, to be an official, to be a public servant at any level, would have to take this government exams, and these were heavily sort of regulated in the sense of what you needed to read, how you answered your questions, and it became increasingly regulated up to the end of the imperial Chinese history. So, of course, the imperial exams meant that there was a curriculum, as I mentioned, shared with you an excerpt from the Practice of the Mean, Zhongyong. So one of the 4 books that was compulsory in the exams, and then it also meant that there was a certain commentary or interpretation that was also compulsory, and that in some ways it meant that everyone who participated in government, formed the government service, would have come from the same background, in the sense that they've done the standard sort of reading. It didn't mean, of course, that they didn't have other ideas, but everyone sort of was talking the same language. There was a common sort of language and understanding. So that the imperial exams had that kind of a role. There's obviously debate about in its later years how functional or how effective it really was, and trying to find the trying to recruit talent to the government. But of course the sort of texts themselves in the imperial exams was not the only way in which Confucian thinking was transmitted, because it wasn't simply book learning. If it was just something in the exams, I guess then it would simply be, like all of us who have gone through exams, and you go through the exams and you forget it. You don't want to look at those books again. But actually, with Confucian learning, these stories, symbols, figures, historical figures, what they did, their examples, and particularly the example of Confucius, was an inspiration to the scholars, but also many people who were even illiterate. So obviously in those days, being literate, going through the exam process was quite expensive, and it took up a lot of time. So there were actually a large section of the population that were illiterate, but at the same time they also learnt and absorbed these ideas and made it part of their lives, because it was sort of something, as I mentioned, learning for living. That these tools could be used in ways that people respond to the situation. But first of all, within the family. That there would be this kind of family, the way family values, the way that you're brought up, the way that you relate to each other, and that sort of transcends the books. So it doesn't have to be through a book, it doesn't have to be through a regulated, imposed exam. But of course, as I mentioned, the imperial examination system, which was, you would say, very much consolidated in late imperial period, was important in ensuring that the government officials had the same sort of foundations. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question. Thank you, Roz.
Thank you, Katherine. I think we'll draw it to a close now. I think it's been a really thought-provoking first session, and I really look forward to joining again in February to look at how we're going to overcome the generation gap and Confucian application to the thinking there. So thank you everybody for coming. Please do sign up for the rest of the series, and as I say, if you're not a SACU member, do think about joining SACU. And we look forward to continuing this learning journey through SACU's 60th year, 2025. So goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.